Languages are weird, and the fact that you can just learn your mother tongue by listening to your parents and kind of repeating what they say, sort of trying out new things, seeing if people understand you, is actually quite a miracle. It's even weirder that we as humans are very capable of actually learning other people's native languages way past the time that we were when we learned our own native language. Whilst all languages have very different rules that govern the grammar and even the meaning of certain words, all languages have at least two types of words in common. Every language in the world that we know of, at least, has nouns and verbs. So from this seemingly universal commonality derives the basic or default sentence structure in all languages. And we can in fact categorize all languages that we know based on how nouns and verbs are by default arranged in their sentences. Now, when linguists talk about this default sentence structure or default word order, we call it an unmarked word order. When we talk about word order, what we actually mean is constituent order. Now, constituents can sometimes be single words, but more often than not they're a combination of a string of words. We call those phrases. And so when we look at constituent order, we always look at different phrases. The basic constituents of every language are more or less based on the word types that all languages have in common. Nouns and verbs. So the default constituent order in every language is basically made up of noun phrases and verbs. Every unmarked sentence in every language consists of at least one noun phrase and a verb. This can change, of course. A lot of languages have a lot of flexibility. For example, Russian or Japanese allow for sentences that only consist of a verb. However, these are marked sentences, not unmarked ones. Now, the bare minimum of an unmarked sentence would be a noun or a noun phrase plus a verb. This could be, I sleep. We have a noun, in fact a proper noun, which we also refer to as a pronoun, I, and this is the subject of the sentence, plus sleep. There are other sentences that require two noun phrases. I eat broccoli. We have again a noun phrase at the beginning, our subject, I. We have our verb, eat. And we have another noun phrase, broccoli, which is the object of the sentence. But how do we know that I am the subject and broccoli is the object of the sentence? Now, in order to understand what an object or what a subject is, it is also important to know what it isn't. For example, there's a very common, however wrong explanation of the role of subjects and objects in a sentence. Many people would say that the subject in a sentence is usually the doer, the one responsible for the action, and the object is the thing or the person being acted upon, the receiver of an action, if you want to. This definition is based on the semantic roles of the constituents. However, subjects and objects are not defined by their semantic roles, by their meaning. What do we mean by they are not defined by their semantic role? Well, let's look at these two sentences for example. Kim detests sprouts. Second sentence, spiders frighten Lil. In the first sentence, we can identify Kim as the subject, and I will explain how we can identify Kim as the subject. And we identify sprouts as the object. In the second sentence, we identify spiders as the subject and Lil is the object. Let's look at the semantic role of the constituents in those sentences. In the first sentence, Kim, our subject, is the experiencer. Kim experiences the detesting of sprouts. And sprouts are considered a stimulus. They stimulate the experience of Kim. In the second sentence, we have spiders that do the frightening. So spiders here are the stimulus. They stimulate the fear. And Lil is the experiencer of the frightening. So as you can see, the semantic roles really don't help us when we want to determine subject and object, because they are very independent of that syntactic role. In order to determine subjecthood or objecthood in different languages, linguists have a couple of tests. The problems with these tests is generally that not all tests apply to all languages, and some languages even need tests that are very special to their language and don't really apply to any other language. However, there are some tests that work for the majority of languages out there. Test number 1, subject-verb agreement. In English, as in many other Indo-European languages, the verb agrees to a certain extent with the subject. What do we mean by that? Well, the verb changes its appearance, its form, based on the character or the appearance and the form of the subject. So, let's look at this situation. I like Jill. Jill likes me. As you can see, if I am the subject, like remains in its kind of basic form. There's no big change to it. However, if we change Lil to be the subject, there is what we in English refer to as the third person singular S. The subject being transformed into third person singular transforms the verb. The same thing can be seen in a lot more detail when we use the verb to be. Say, I am happy, you are happy, he, she, or it is happy, we are happy, and so on. As you can see, based on the plurality and the person of the subject, the verb changes its form. Other languages have much stronger subject-verb agreement. German, for example, has extremely complex subject-verb agreement, which regularly drives learners of German insane when they have to memorize conjugation tables. Some languages absolutely don't have subject-verb agreement. So that's not a surefire test. Test 2. Unmarked constituent order. Now, in the beginning of this video, I talked about constituent order and I talked about what unmarked means. So the first thing that we want to understand about a language is what is the unmarked constituent order. English, for example, is what we call an SVO language. The default order of constituents is always going to be subject first, then the verb, and then the object. English is very strict on its constituent order, so there's not a lot of flexibility of turning it around, which makes it rather easy to identify. Other languages don't make it that easy because they allow a higher degree of freedom. However, generally speaking, you can sort of figure out based on frequency and a native speaker's intuition what the most default word order of a language is. We know, because English is an SVO language, that the subject always has to come in front of the verb and the object has to come after the verb. So, whenever we look at a sentence like Jill likes apples, we know that likes is a verb, we can clearly identify it, so the noun phrase in front of the verb has to be the subject and the noun phrase after the verb has to be an object. Now, English is an SVO language. However, not all languages have subject, verb, object as their default constituent order. Other languages might be SOV languages. For example, Latin and Japanese are SOV languages. Other languages start with the verb. VSO languages like Welsh do in fact exist and are to be found in all corners of the world. And in fact, all possible combinations of those three constituents have actually been found in the world's languages. So now we figured out the word order, but how do we know that the noun phrase in first place in English is in fact a subject and not an object? How can we be sure that English is an SVO language and not an OVS language? Test 3, accusative and nominative case. English is what we consider an accusative language, so it reflects accusative or nominative case on its constituents. This is very important to make clear at this point because there's a whole nother category of languages that use a completely different system of case markings, which are called ergative languages. And I definitely want to talk about ergative languages in a future video, but now is not the right time, so we'll have to only look at accusative languages with this test. A lot of languages have a way of morphologically marking or indicating that a noun phrase is either a subject or an object. We call those case markings. When we learn English, we often learn that unlike most of its Germanic cousins, English actually has dropped its case markings over the history of its development. If we compare English to a language like German with very heavy case marking, we see that it is almost impossible to look at the form of an English noun phrase and know what case it would be. In German, this is a lot easier because German goes to huge lengths in order to tell us if a noun is nominative or in fact accusative. The nominative case is considered the subject case, and accusative case is considered the direct object case. So how can we determine accusative or nominative case in a language like English where all case markings have been lost, more or less? Well, luckily, the case markings haven't been completely lost. They remain. We have, you could call it, fossils of those case markings in the pronouns of English, in fact. Probably in school you have learned that we distinguish between subject and object pronouns. So we can say that all the subject pronouns are our nominative pronouns. They show nominative case marking, and all our object pronouns are accusative. They show accusative case marking. So how do we apply that knowledge of object and subject pronouns to a sentence that just has a general noun like the cat? Let's use this example. The cat catches the mouse. Well, if we just substitute both nouns with pronouns, we end up with a not very helpful sentence. It catches it. So now the question is, how do we determine nominative and dative case? Well, the easiest thing to do in order to test our hypothesis that the first position belongs to subjects and the third position in the sentence after the verb belongs to objects is by assuming the cat's and the mouse's gender. So we have a female cat and a female mouse. She catches her. Suddenly the case markings become very apparent and we can clearly say that the first position is given to the subject and the second position is given to the object based on the case marking. Now, not all languages mark cases on the words themselves, on the nouns themselves. Japanese, for example, has found a very ingenious alternative way to mark cases. Japanese puts small particles, one-syllable words, to the word, to the constituent they apply to. So let's look at an example from Japanese to illustrate an alternative way of marking cases. Kim ga boru o ketta. Kim, subject particle, ball, object particle, kicked. So let's look at those particles that I was talking about. You can clearly see that there's a small syllable called ga, whose only purpose it really is to tell us that Kim is the subject of the sentence. Then we have the object, which is followed by another small syllable, o. This syllable is only there in order to tell us that the ball, boru, is the object of the sentence. This is another form of case marking. Let's summarize. A subject, in English at least, has subject-verb agreement. The form of the verb changes based on the form of the subject. Furthermore, we can identify a subject or an object in English based on the default, the unmarked constituent order. English is an SVO language. The subject comes before the verb, the object follows the verb. Lastly, we can determine subjecthood or objecthood based on case markings. Whilst in English we have lost those case markings on most nouns, they still remain fossilized in the subject and object pronouns. So, by substituting our noun phrases for the subject position and the object position with pronouns, we can identify their syntactic role. Lastly, does understanding the difference between subject and object make you a better language learner or even a better language teacher? Well, not necessarily. Most of the time, people can learn these aspects of any language very intuitively. It's just sometimes a helpful tool to understand the differences when it comes to explaining more complicated misunderstandings in any language. However, this is not a sure shot to learning languages faster. Just because you can identify subjects and you know where they go, or you know how to handle the case marking of objects, doesn't really give you any skill in creatively using the language. Because most languages, and even our very rigid English, allow a lot of flexibility in the end that can be used in order to speak more coherently or express ideas differently. However, understanding the rules that govern how different languages organize their internal structure and how they apply logic to their syntax is actually a beautiful illustration of how complex and diverse the world's languages really are. And so it should help us understand that learning languages is really difficult and not easy.